to a range of high-profile companies and has led, advised, and coached over 1,000 pitches, and he's not exhausted yet. Where is he? Michael.
Thank you, Mariella. Good morning. Sort of follow that. When I left advertising, which is about 8 years ago, which is a world of pitching, I didn't really expect to be here today talking to another world of pitching, yours. I have written a book, and I guess my author's platform, which I had to start preparing, included the fact that I competed in a couple of Olympic Games, Tokyo and Mexico, before many were born, as a high hurdler. And more importantly, I suppose, was the 1,000 pitches that I've taken part in, led, or whatever. Now, I won some, I lost a lot. I like to think I learnt from most of them. And in September last year, a Thursday at 11:30 precisely, after much pushing and shoving, I was given the opportunity of a 10-minute telephone conversation to a commissioning editor. This was the pitch of my life. As you can imagine, everything I'd learnt went into pitch mode in a few days before, had I got the concept, had I found the compelling arguments. And I guess above all, how was I going to handle the sort of emotional intensity which I wanted to go down the telephone without sort of terrifying the person at the other end in this 10-minute, apparently informal conversation? I'm happy to say it worked, and that's why the book is now coming out. I'm also happy to say that I was lucky enough to have a very, very perceptive editor working with me. Because at that stage, the book was intended more for an audience like this, people in business pitches. But when we sat down together and looked at the early concepts, it was so obvious in a way that the principles that I intended to talk about were really common to anyone pitching or persuading, whether it's an audition, going for an interview at university, interviewing out of university into your first job, charity fundraising, or pitching more broadly, as most of you will be familiar. At the same time, my own personal view is that there's a common error across just about all of those types of pitching, and certainly I'm guilty of it, is that in the preparation we tend to spend almost all of our time, our effort, and our energy in what I'd call the sort of content side, the rational side. We stay in our comfort zones. If you're creative, until midnight before, you'll try and find yet another brilliant creative execution. If you're a strategist, how can you further argue for this sort of game-changing, seems to be the word applying to strategies these days, how can you improve on it? And we spend less time in our non-comfort zone for most of us, which is performing on the day when it matters. That's what led me to a new title for the book, which, as Mariella said, is It's Not What You Say, It's the Way You Say It. Now, I was interested, the theme of the conference is connecting creativity, because I'm married to a creative. My wife is a creative director on the copywriting side, and like most creatives, has that sort of healthy or non-healthy disregard of suits, lacking emotional IQ and all that sort of stuff. So when I asked her to read the final draft of the book, and having done so, she said, wait a minute, this book is all about emotion. And you, dear husband, are emotionally challenged. Whether she's right or wrong, the fact is, it is the emotional side of the pitch I want to talk about. And I want to look at three areas. The first of these is, what is the emotional response you're trying to get from your audience? Then, given this view of mine that you spend so much time on rational, how do you get some priority, give through the emotional element of what you're doing. And finally, some thoughts on bringing emotion into performance. About 8 years ago, there was a really thoughtful article which appeared in the advertising trade press, Campaign magazine, written by a guy who then headed up the Advertising Agency Register. That's a company whose sole purpose in life is to help clients through the decision process when they're selecting an agency. And his name is Martin Jones, had sat in on about 600 or 700 competitive pitches, not having to take the decision, but just simply observing the way the clients arrived at a decision. And his article, in effect, said, "Dear creative agency heads, sorry to disappoint you, but the clients are not taking the decision on the brilliance of your creative idea or your understanding of the brief. It usually comes down to how they answer a couple of simple questions. And the first of these questions, sounding innocuous, is, will I get on with these people? In other words, will I like them? So, likability. Now, I'm sure everyone in the room here is likable. It's very hard to exist in this world of business unless you are. However, under the sort of tension of a pitch or forgetting your words, likability can become a sort of false enthusiasm, and charm gets a little bit diminished. And yet, likability is so important. In politics, I guess, in the last recent history, someone who more than anybody else seemed to influence through his likability and charm was Nelson Mandela. In the UK right now, for those of you who live here, we have three senior politicians: our Prime Minister, David Cameron, his deputy, Clegg, and the opposition, Mr. Miliband, who I'm sure they're quite charming in their private lives, but right now their charm is wearing thin. And they are suffering because the extreme party UKIP, which is doing this against all the odds, is led by somebody who seems to be, his persona is likeable, Nigel Farage, the likeable guy in the pub. That likability alone, I'm sure, is contributing to a hell of a lot of the votes he's apparently will get. The other aspect of emotional response I want to talk about came from the other question asked by these clients. How much do they really want our business, our opportunity, or how hungry are they? Hunger. Now, I work with big professional companies who, like you, find themselves pitching for contracts from hundreds to millions of pounds. One of them always gets a senior consultant researcher to go and talk to the decision makers, win or lose. And they always ask, amongst others, the question, did we seem hungry? Wherever the reply was no, they did not win the business. To me, I have two stories which I think illustrate this in particular. In 2005, 5 cities were pitching for what you might say was one of the biggest entertainment opportunities of the lot, to host the Olympic Games. The cities were New York, Moscow, Madrid, Paris, London. London did a brilliant pitch and won. And the pitch has been much written about, but a story which isn't often mentioned was the role of then Prime Minister Tony Blair. Then, not so much now, but then highly regarded around the world. The pitch was in Singapore. He couldn't attend because there was a G8 summit he had to host. He turned up 2 days before, and in the space of 48 hours, he's personally spent one-on-one conversations with between 40 and 50 of the voting IOC delegates. For each of them, that's quite a sort of kudos to spend this time with Tony Blair. But more than anything, it sent out a signal of hunger. Meanwhile, the Paris bid, which was, if any of you remember, definitely the bookie's favourite at that time, they were expected to win. President Chirac could attend. made a short speech, and then totally distanced himself from proceedings. Who was hungriest, Paris or London? Another one which I came across, right now, Angelina Jolie is in the news a lot, talking about her new film, Unbroken, which apparently has been given the biggest ever budget for a female director on a war type of film. And she was on, I think it was NBC or something earlier this year. And this is how she was talking about how she pitched to Universal Studios. This has been the hardest thing I've ever done. I had all these hours of phone calls and things and made all these boards. I took my glue and tape and pictures off the internet. I put all these boards in a garbage bag and I carried them myself to Universal and put them out. And I pitched my butt off. I think that's a great example of hunger. So, two of the big emotional responses which I think you have to be looking for. Now, if I'm right, and I think I am, certainly in the advertising business, we spend all our time worrying about the rational content. What can you do to give the emotional element more room, more space? How can you prioritize the emotion? And unlike Francesca, who is looking ahead, I was looking back 2,500 years to Aristotle and his friends. I have no classical background, but I have since been reading books on rhetoric. And one of the things that helps you, I think, allow the emotion to come through, is right at the beginning, think of how you're going to arrange your material. In something called the 5 canons of rhetoric, of which there are 5, the third one is about arrangement. And the word used in Greek is taxis, which apparently translates beautifully as arranging your troops for battle. So as you go into your next pitch, think taxis, as you arrange your troops. Now, the first arrangement, I think, seems obvious, but often I've been in pitches where I can't even find it. What is your central proposition? Or I prefer to use the word promise, because it always is about a promise of future performance. Because promise means you find words which you can say with some level of emotion. In the book, I've used the heading in this particular chapter, you need 50 words or less to woo your lover. And I deliberately use those words because you are always in a form of courtship. Incidentally, while sort of getting ready for today, and I was looking back and trying to find a particular thought or selling idea more relevant to here, and I came across, some of you will know it, that when Aliens was first pitched by whoever it was, he said to the audience, think Jaws in space. A pretty great line. So that's the first of your troops. Get it sorted first. Then you need to find, I believe, you follow what I call, it's not my name for it, the rule of 3. Find 3 supporting arguments. Why 3? I don't know. It seems to be the magic number. It does work. The temptation is to have a stream of great things. This. You might end with 100 things which are brilliant to support your proposition. People can't listen to lists. They can't listen to a shopping list. So you need to find a way of grouping your argument under 3 headings. Today, the observant will have noticed that my first heading was emotional response. I'm now talking about emotional priority, and I'll move on in a second to emotional performance. But going back again to these marvelous Greeks, they use the word within this same arrangement in Latin, exordium, which means to prepare the audience in such a way that they will be disposed to lend a ready ear to the rest of the speech. That was by Quintilian, who was a fellow near enough of Aristotle. Finally, coming to performance, and getting emotion into performance. You have to accept that to some extent you're an actor on stage. Your stage may be a platform. It can be across a table in a coffee bar, a conference, it can be even on the telephone. But it is a stage. Now, actors, unlike us, have the benefit of great scripts by, let us say, William Shakespeare. Actors may also have the benefit of a direction by a Sam Mendes. We don't have those, but we do have the ability to rehearse. No actor goes on stage without rehearsal. 2 thoughts on rehearsal. And certainly this is true in the advertising business. Most agents, if they're lucky, have one scramble run-through at the last minute. And a run-through, to my mind, is not a rehearsal. A run-through is about making sure you've got somewhere to put your props. It is about who sits where, who hands over, rough timings. There's no pressure. It's very important, but it's not putting a pressure on you performing. You do that separately, and then you have a rehearsal which is all about performing when it matters. And if I had my time again, I would have put a rule book into my agency of minimum 3 rehearsals, because I'm sure of the return on investment. And the thing about rehearsing, you can't rehearse yourself, nor can you get a member of your team to rehearse you, because they all know what's coming next, and they'll be worrying about words. You need someone relatively independent who is just simply sitting as an audience and thinking, how do you come across? It seems very obvious, but most people avoid doing that. Creatives in particular, incidentally, in the advertising business, will do anything rather than rehearse. I will keep all my energy for the day, thank you very much. It's a kind of form of cowardice. It's an excuse. I've never yet seen people not improve through rehearsal. So what do you ask your rehearser to look for on the final point? Just 4 thoughts to start off with, or to finish with, rather. The first one is the pause. Of all the things you can most simply take on board, if you're a bit nervous, is to pause. In our normal speech, we pause for thought, we pause to make a point, and importantly, we pause to just check our audience is actually listening to us. We all do that all the time. That is something you can practice. And again, sorry to go back 2,500 years, but in the Bible of rhetoric, I think it's 2,300 years, author unknown. This is what they said then when rhetoric was taught. Pauses strengthen the voice. They also render the thoughts more clear-cut by separating them and leave the hearer time to think. Nothing new under the sun. So, pulling all that together, emotion in your performance makes a huge difference to whether you win or lose.